We're excited today. We got our first speaker today, someone with over 30 years of experience in OT and IT, provides strategic guidance across multiple countries. He is a distinguished fellow and has co-founded several technology solution companies. Please give a hand for Mr. Sean Curry, y'all.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to speak from down here because it feels weird to be up on the stage. So if you guys can't see me, just let me know. I'm a big enough guy. I think it shouldn't be a problem. So, conversation today that I was going to have with the group is using standard frameworks and offering some advice on how to use them and apply them from field experience on helping define OT in terms of risk management and inform leadership and other groups about what you need to do and what you can do and what they may make decisions not to do. So fundamentally, we are going to be talking about control systems and the products that the control systems create out there in the field. For the most part, I have a few slides that I'm going to go through where I kind of set the stage for why are control systems at risk. For anybody in here that works in that field, this is just going to be rote, you've seen it before kind of thing, so nothing unique there. I'm going to try to get us through walking through the 62443 process and running through each of the steps with offering practical experience on what we've seen and what's happened in our customer base, at least with my organization. But generally speaking, I think everybody knows that historically, if you've worked in control systems and control systems OT, the fundamental security practice was an air gap, right? So you separated OT from IT, you kept clean barriers between the two, never shall the two meet kind of thing. And over the last 20 years, that's been eroded. So as the industry's changed, we've modernized and we've seen things like central decision-making groups needing to make practical business calls on the data that's being produced by these systems that exist in the field. So you'll see things like historians and that kind of thing that collect information from locations. So that starts to bridge the IT and the OT barrier, and generally you'll see stuff with multiple interfaces and those kinds of devices. And then we continue to move along and you see more and more erosion of those barriers. So SCADA obviously has been a thing that's been going on forever with central control of these types of platforms. You can move all the way from SCADA to, in the last 10 years or so, introduction of secure remote access, or not insecure remote access as the case may be, to allow field operators to get into platforms as workforces reduces, which is a practical issue that's very common, or you need to get OEMs and those types of people into these platforms in order to do remote programming and maintenance. So the erosion of that barrier really introduces a great deal of risk because these platforms were engineered for isolation, and they use protocols that are running in clear text. They use equipment that is not hardened, even to the point that I would tell you guys never to actively scan when you're doing vulnerability assessments and that kind of stuff, this type of equipment, because you're likely to introduce a fault or at least introduce a condition that might cause a fault later or an interruption of service if a plant operator sees something they don't expect. So you have to be extremely careful when you work around these things. That data drives a ton of decisions that comes out of these platforms, so everything I talked about are valid reasons to bridge these gaps, but as a result, anytime you create a bridge, people can pass both ways, right? You don't go just one direction, you can go both. So as we look at things, as we work today, you're even seeing these platforms that have gone through rigorous factory acceptance testing with the OEMs start to have more and more introduction of other components that are being added by ancillary groups, including the operators that exist in the field, in order to get their jobs done. Anybody who works in this industry has probably heard of E1, but you'll start to see remote access gateways with wireless connectivity, LTE type stuff that gets jacked in for remote monitoring. Every OEM I'm aware of has some type of remote monitoring and data collection platform that they're trying to introduce in order to make better decisions, like if they're Caterpillar, they're trying, and it's an engine doing compression, they may be trying to do things like monitor for predictive failure, and so all of these are laudable ideas, right? But they mean people like us have to do something about it. And to that end, In my opinion, the most practical methodology or framework you can use in order to answer some of those questions to people on both sides of the fence is the IEC 62443 framework. So a little background on that. We all know about the Purdue reference model if you work in this field, right? Purdue offered a set of guidelines. It's not a network topology by any means or a security model, just to be clear. But they offered a practical set of guidelines on how to think about the structure of a control system, right? Level 0 to level 5, and all of us in the room who have come and work with integrations work in the level 3 kind of sector, where level 0 and level 1 are safety instrumented systems. So that was adopted by the ISA 99 working group, for anybody that's also familiar with that term. So ISA 99, or ISA, was looking for a set of framework of standards they could adopt, and they looked at a lot of the general purpose NIST standards for IT that existed at the time, some of the standard IT controls that we all may apply, which are also useful, but found that they were deficient because the practical application of technology in the control system is so much different than it is in an IT system. And you really shift things on its head from being confidentiality, integrity, and availability focused to being safety, reliability, and productivity focused, right? So you have a different mindset when you're trying to deal with these platforms. It's all about, number one, keeping human beings safe in the field, because these things can actually hurt people in the practical application of their controls. And beyond that, you have to have reliable production of whatever widget your company creates, or the company you're assessing creates, or somebody, wants out of this thing. And that can vary from energy companies producing power. I can, like one of our customers is Smithfield, who does pork product processing, right? So the ribs and Nathan's hot dogs everybody gets, those are produced in a factory with control systems. And the risk to the larger national infrastructure may be different, but the risk of the human at the end point of that line is often very similar. So because of the gap there, ISA 99 was created, adopted the Purdue reference model, so it was appropriate for a while to call what we think of that 5-layer diagram as being the Purdue reference model, now being ISA 99. And then ISA and the IEC folded those together into the 62443 framework of standards. So you could call them ISA 62443, you could call them IEC 62443. That working group lives together, and there's only one component that's separate from that, but it's not worth talking about in this conversation because it's the exception, not the rule. But it brings to us several key concepts that honestly sound a little obvious. And the reason I've got 4 of them highlighted in red there is the top 4 are the most risk adverse and the ones that are most control system focused, right? So in IT, generally we're not worried about physical damage to systems as an example, or to my previous point, the safety of individuals working on these production lines. We might lose data, that's obviously bad. We might put the organization at risk for loss of intellectual property on an IT side conversation of this type. But on an OT side, we might be talking about valves not working. We might talk about turbine blades throwing through walls. Those kinds of things are practically possible once you start changing the parameters of the control systems themselves. And there's a myriad of examples on those. But the IACS term, Industrial Automation and Control Systems concept, is one that I tend to use more often than not. And I've also been able to use the terms and the framework of 62443 to relate to even board level personnel risk without having to invent the taxonomy, which I think is super valuable. So we don't have to invent new words and play games with those and explain definitions. I don't know how many customer engagements I've been in where somebody wants me to define OT. And before I started using the 62443 framework, I would give them my general description of OT is something that moves in the real world. That's the practical definition. But then you get in semantic arguments with people that don't want to do projects, and you can get past that by saying, look, I didn't invent these definitions and I didn't invent this framework. I'm using the same thing the International Association of Engineers that write the automation code follow. So why don't we just stick with the standard, right? The other components of the key concepts all break down, and fundamentally, you'll hear me talk about this later, you always end up with the same set of, if we think about it from a security perspective, security controls recommendations to wrap these IACS platforms in. It's network segmentation, it's secure remote access, it's incident response, and in my opinion, the real focus of incident response in this context should be The ability to recover from either failure, misuse, or abuse. So how do you do recovery of these platforms in a practical way? To pull the thread on that a little bit, because it's the one that's hardest to discuss. The control system manufacturers and OEMs have provided configurations for these platforms. But in a lot of cases, when you guys are working in these areas, these things have existed for 30 years, right? So over the course of that time, individual INC techs and those kind of people have gone in and changed PLC programming, for instance, with different ladder logic. They've expanded production lines. They've modified them in order to meet their needs. They've done other integrations, maybe with downstream lateral partners that are collecting data from the asset, or even in some cases, they're doing cohabitation of these platforms with other industrial processes where one feeds another. You might be providing steam from a plant over to another facility. Like an example I've got is where another facility does date production, and they use that to dry the dates out. But generally speaking, that integration layer all has changed so much since the original OEM implementation that the factory acceptance testing configurations and backups you got have been changed. Now, good control system techs will be doing manual backups. A lot of those times they'll exist on USB drives that exist there on the fields. Some of the OEMs have engineering workstations that'll do those backups of those platforms for them, but just nailing down what the process is, making sure people are prepared for that event, is what I'm talking about in terms of incident response, and kind of the third pillar. Fourth is transient systems, right? So the fact is the same people we're talking about that use the secure remote access also use local USB drives that they jack into these machines, which is where we see lateral movement of things like CryptoLocker and that kind of thing. They use their own workstations from the OEMs. We've seen actual Emerson, for instance, techs come into control systems to do maintenance that bring malicious code into an environment, get behind these barriers that may exist from a network segmentation perspective, and then laterally proliferate code that causes other problems. So, and then sometimes it's not even malicious. It's just somebody's got something on their laptop that may do something to the local network that you don't expect. But transient systems are a big problem. And then the fifth one is vulnerability and asset management, right? So never change what you don't understand. So you need some context for what's going on in these environments if you're trying to help manage risk within them. And then that context first comes from a simple asset inventory, which you'd be shocked if you guys don't work in this industry about how many of these organizations don't have. They don't even know what they've got, let alone what versions of codes it's running or what vulnerabilities they have. But as we go through this, those 5 kind of pillars, which match pretty closely with the SANS Institute's 5 kind of common areas of interest in terms of OT security, are where almost all of your recommendations will end up being at a first pass at any of this kind of thing. To talk about 62443, they've got different modules within it. The one specifically I recommend people look at first and then you can put to use most quickly to do your own assessments is the 3.2 set of concepts. There's actually an entire assessment process for that. Anybody that wants it, I can send you a copy of Cavalry's, my organization's actual step-by-step process we use to train new troopers that we send into the field to do these assessments on, so you can do your own. It's not black magic. We've just adopted and added our own experience to the 3.2 process, but even if you just went out and paid for the IEC 62443 set of standards, you could go through that if you like reading government documents and figure out how to do an assessment from that. But key concepts that exist, and you'll hear these words, and if you hear these coming from somebody, they're following a 62443 framework, that aren't earth-shattering, right? So zone, simple isolated set of segments where things can communicate with each other without any interruption. So if we think about a power plant, that would be your balance of plant might be a zone, turbine control might be a zone, your steam management might be a zone. That's true across any lateral set of communications, and like in pipeline assets, you'll often see automation and measurement, which should be in separate zones, actually commingled into the same zone and just called automation. But the paths you take in and out of those zones are called conduits in this context, right? So a conduit is a method of communication from point A to point B, and it's important to remember the conduits aren't just electronic, right? As a part of these assessments, physical security is a factor that comes into play. And you need to think about gateways into and out of facilities as conduits. Are they monitored? Are they measured? Are they controlled? And what impact does that have to the control system? If not, some practical environments you can't do conduit control, and you've got to have compensating controls, just like we would with anything else. Boundary makes up the barrier, and that could be software, hardware again, or a physical boundary itself. A fence line is a boundary in these control system facilities as an example. May not be a tremendously effective boundary, but it's a boundary indeed. CRS is a tricky one, so that cybersecurity requirement specification, that's the result of the 6244332 assessment process is going to nail down what the requirements for the asset are. And as we go through the process here in a minute, you'll see how we do that. But the fundamental idea is we're going to identify the security level target for the platform that we're assessing, meaning to the business, whatever the customer business is, whatever your business is, what is the target security level from a standards basis, 1 through 4, that we need to apply, and I'll show some of those here in a minute. And then what is the actual security level of the controls or the environment with no controls as it may exist, and then what is the gap? So as we define that gap analysis, we're going to write down all of the actual requirements to meet the foundational requirements that you see next that are spelled out, that again line directly with NIST 882R3. They look very familiar to most of us because they're pretty common sense ideas about things you need to control, but that's what you see in the foundational requirements. And I hate this word because people think I make it up, but the IACS in question that you're assessing, or the group of IACSs that may contribute to the process, 62443 calls a suck. And every time I say it, people look at me sideways like, you should call that something else. But not my term, came from 62443. So there's lots I like about this, but they should rename that because it sounds silly. But they come up with a better acronym. But SUC stands for Systems Under Consideration, or System Under Consideration. And the idea is, as you go through even a single manufacturing plant, there may be 12 different SUCs involved that you're assessing that have some type of a balance of plant or have some remote SCADA system that's managing all those different SUCs. But you have to review them individually because their contribution to your business process is likely going to be different. Different levels of risk, get different levels of control, get different levels of attention, so that you can start to prioritize and help your leadership prioritize their investments and their focus in terms of what they're going to deliver out there in the real world, or have you deliver, as the case may be. Security levels I talked about. There's 3 major concepts here. Security level capability is a target that the systems can provide when they're integrated and configured properly, right? So, like I was talking about, some of these older systems with older proprietary protocols that run in clear text, their capability for security is much lower. They're going to be running Windows 98 on panels, on HMIs. They're going to be running BSD out there in the field, so you can't take modern practices for things like installing agents for XDR and just slap those on those things, because you're going to cause major issues if you can even get them to work at all. So you got to be very careful. So there's a component of this that's the capability of the platform itself and how much protection you have to wrap around it, and that's where SLC comes in. SLD is a target I just mentioned, and we'll walk through how you actually get to what you are basically assessing the target for the IACS or SUC to be as a portion of the 7-step process we're going to go through here in a second. And then the security level achieved is after we've applied our controls to them. So after we do network segmentation and secure remote access and vulnerability and asset management and all the other things I talked about, what's our actual attained target? Because at some point, with what you're capable of doing or what you're even permitted to do is a way to think about this in the field too, because yeah, you have to remember when you go into these sites, you're not always going to be able to do everything you want to do, right? You have to do what's best, and at some point, they will, a lot of times, a customer will accept the risk, but it's your job to make sure they understand what they're accepting in reasonable terms. So you can kind of see the security levels 1 through 4 and how they lay out, and means, the resources, skills, and motivation all come into play as you think about where something's going to sit. The 1 and 2 levels are pretty close, and I generally think of 1 and 2 falling into the monitoring only category of types of control that may exist out there in the field. So if all you've got is historical coming back and there's no actual opportunity in terms of the way the system's architected to send a control signal, there's lots of platforms, Leptofino firewalls and that kind of thing that exist in the field that will prevent you, for instance, from sending a Modbus write command into one of these control systems. It's at a protocol layer. They can't send a write across. You can only send read to coils. And in that case, the risk is often not insignificant because there's still valuable data there and you still have to protect those systems, but it's not as critical as maybe a security level 4 target where that asset is under remote control and you can start to do things that violate the safety instrumented systems policies that may exist in the field. So shutting off monitoring on a pressure valve downstream from a steam engine of some kind, for instance, is an example of something you might do that would could cause physical damage to an operator working in that space that you have to prevent, right? And the skill level generally goes up as the time goes on, right? So at some point, we're dealing with highly motivated actors with lots of strong techniques, with infinite number of resources, and you've got to deal with the practical recovery methods then on what you're going to do when a control system's compromised. But that's relatively rare. We're talking about nuclear facilities, Department of Defense facilities, that kind of stuff that sits in 4. Almost all the stuff in the industries I see sits between 2 and 3 as we go through this assessment process. There's also a component of its people, process, tools, right, as we all know, that go into actually running a secure organization, or in this case, a secure control system or SUC. As you assess the technology, and we can get way too focused on technology because it's the fun part of the conversation, right? But the people executing, monitoring, managing these controls, the control system operators in the field, need to know things like when they see something that's off, how do they say something? How do they report that back, maybe to your central security organization, or if they don't exist, report it out back to a regulator if they're a regulated entity? How does that information not get lost when they think they see something that might be going wrong? And that can be, I saw something strange in my MDF that wasn't there before. That could be I seeing strange action on my HMI where something doesn't look the way it did before. So the people portion of that process and their training then folds into the process portion on simple things like manual backups, tabletops, the kind of things you're going to want to do that you can use to enrich the environment and use the tools that you've got in place. And the technology is the last component. But I did this mapping to CMMI because it's the easiest way to talk to executive leadership about the 62443 levels and the CMMI levels because they've seen CMMI level type concepts before, generally, if it's a modern IT organization, right? But is it repeatable? Can you reproduce it? Is there a continuous improvement process moves you up and down the scale, right? It's simple questions. Again, when we do these assessments, my team will go in and often ask, what is your recovery process if you lost these 3 HMIs in that engineering workstation? And if there is a process, even if it's something that's just institutional knowledge, they move up on this scale, right? But if there's nothing, and it's, well, we're going to call Jerry, who used to do this 10 years ago, and he's going to tell us, but he works at another plant, then they're obviously on the lower side of the scale. And that organization, one of the recommendations you may make at the end is going to be, it's not just tools we need to buy, we need to invest in changing our culture so that we can get to repeatable processes. And that cultural change is the biggest drama all of us are going to have trying to practically help people defend this type of infrastructure in the field. Getting people to recognize the value who really are hired to do something physical in the physically manifested cyber-physical world is more difficult than it might be if we were dealing with technical operators or information workers on the back end of an office building. So this is the promised 7-step workflow. And ZCR stands for Zone and Conduit Requirement, and the concept is with each step here, we're building to the final requirement sheet that we can use to make decisions as a business. And that's where you're going to drive your roadmaps and your frameworks and your recommendations for budget and attention to your leadership from. So one of the key portions of this, and what you see, by the way, on the left and you see on the right are the inputs and the outputs of each step of the process. There's actually a document produced at every stage of this process that manifests in the final whole. So it's not as onerous as it might feel. But what you'll see is, in most cases, when we start with customers, Every customer I've had in Cavalry for the last 10 years starts with a conversation where I don't know what I've got in OT, I don't know what the risk is, I don't know what to do with it. And so the answer is send me your information, which is actually the first step where we look at potential hazard analysis sheets that they may have about blast radius from the loss of a turbine or the loss of a refinery control system. What are your procedures, your policies, tolerance, risk, anything I can gain from you that if you've written down already, give it to me, right? And ZCR1 really lays into what is the system under consideration, because in a lot of cases, people can't even tell you that. They're like, we've got control systems at a facility, out there in the fleet. Cool. What does it do? It runs our, like I said, our pork processing. We kill 34,000 hogs a day at this one Smithfield facility, right? So if that's the conversation, then what is it individually that they do? What are the lines of production that contribute to that? And you'll often find multiple IACS platforms, multiple control systems that you have to identify, figure out how they stitch together, and then describe back to the customer, probably for the first time. And in my experience doing this now for 10 years with thousands of these audits under our belts, what we found is we usually end up knowing more than the central leadership teams about what happens in the field than they do. And that information and context can enrich all kinds of thought processes on the back end, right? You'll end up training your customer on what they actually do, which is important, of course. So in each of these slides, I kind of lay out what it says in 62443, because like I said, I'm not trying to say I invented it, I use it, right? And then what the Cavalry practical implementation is. So the definitions of what sit in the SUCs can be like a SCADA platform, maybe its own system under consideration. Balance of plant is going to be its own system under consideration. Every production line that's isolated that may be on its own DLR, device layer ring for people that don't work in this industry, may be its own system under consideration. And some of them you're going to get more data about than others, but that's okay. You're just trying to nail down what it is. And what we do is we'll spend a lot more time with the plant manager of the facility and the control systems techs than we do with security or IT leadership on the back end. So we live in the field with them and participate in gathering information in non-intrusive ways to make their lives easier. And in a lot of cases, you're just going to talk to the OEM, right? So if you walk in and it's a, let me think of one, a GE HMI that you're looking at, and it's obvious GE did the implementation, ask for the contact for the rep from GE that worked the plant and ask for a letter of authority so that you can ask them questions so that you can get the as-built that they did when they did FAT. And then you'll know what it was going to look like or what they envisioned it was going to look like when it left the factory. Because all these things are built on the back end in a factory somewhere. But that first step is to lay out as much of the internal system architecture at a high level and to output the enriched system architecture from the detail you have in order to how to move that forward. Second step of the process, and all of these, like I said, are laid out in 62443, are the initial cyber risk assessment. So by gathering the data that the company has about their own concerns, this is where you do talk to risk managers and that kind of thing about what that may happen to them. So a lot of people will tell you, I'm worried about failing a TSA audit. That's a pretty simple one that will come up in conversations, right? It's okay, TSA has a set of processes that we can use to apply. It'll give you a list of requirements, and then you start to compare what you've learned at a 10,000 foot level with no system level interrogation yet about that platform to what could happen. And one of the things, like I said, if you guys want to follow up, I'll send anybody in the room with our processes a list of standard threat actors, standard hazards, standard risks that exist in these types of environments. They can use as a worksheet as you consider these things so you don't forget them, right? Impacts to health, safety, environmental risk, business interruption, production loss, product quality, that kind of thing are kind of the hallmarks of what we're looking for here, right? These systems aren't going to be patched on a regular basis, just to be clear, for the ones we're talking about. If they are, hallelujah, you got a greenfield platform that just got implemented by Cell, and more power to you. But that's not going to be commonly the case, right? So you're going to see things that are going to freak you out if you look at it from an IT perspective. Looking at it from an OT perspective is, does it function? What are the actual practical risks to that environment? How can we mitigate those risks? What is possible to do? rather than what is, I think, from my golden throne and running risk management at an enterprise level, a necessary thing that has to happen to every platform. So you get through that process, you come up with an initial evaluation of risk. And that guides you to what should this environment look like in terms of zones and conduits. So a lot of cases, you're going to find flat networks with everything on the same segment. A lot of times it's going to be commingled between OT and IT because somebody had a switch laying around that was at an IT site where they could physically hop through it as almost like a repeater to get from point A to point B. And you're going to see broadcast traffic traversing VLANs it might not supposed to, even though it, to anyone who's worked in the networking industry, is going to say, well, it's obviously in the same broadcast domain. I could easily see that broadcast ARP that's going to come across. I can put my address on that segment, and I can directly reach my PLC or control system that's moving things in the field. And the second you do that, you'll start to see issues. But it's not uncommon to see IT and OT commingled. It's not uncommon to find everything on the same segment. And it's also not uncommon to find a myriad of vendors who've just jacked stuff in order to get remote telemetry. So, let alone internal platform optimization teams and metering teams and those kind of things. They'll have plugged in RTU in the wrong spot. They'll have plugged a Moxa in the wrong spot. They'll have other components that they needed to get working one day that just happened to go into an interface. It's going to bridge fault domains, which is what we're trying to separate with the zone concept. So as you go through this, again, there's practical and there's useful recommendations. So practical recommendations are things you can do. Useful recommendations are things that they should do immediately, right? And the differentiation is you may not have the physical space to do full network segmentation at some of these assets, right? You may need to put IT intradist ports out there in field locations and control rooms so people can get to their timesheets and corporate, platforms for reporting in their status and whatever else the corporation may have those individual employees do, regardless of whether it's part of a control system. And that may physically exist in an area that's so remote from the actual, let's call it minimum point of entry, where all the actual termination for remote connectivity normally sits, that they are not going to put it at 2,000 sites another set of physical gear, run the fiber it might take to do that, let you do the remote isolation. So that's when the conversation about security level target comes into play. If it's a security level target 4 asset, as you're doing your risk assessment here, then that isolation is a recommendation you need to make. If it's a security level 1 target asset, commingling assets with logical isolation like VLANs is certainly reasonable and is commonplace. So it's all about what you're trying to protect and what the impact of that individual cyber physical asset is on the overall risk management of that platform. So you move from there into, we want to separate, so we've done our assessment, and then we start to look at ways that we can recommend to separate business and ICS assets. And the zones really do help you do that, right? So pretty straightforward concepts, maybe a myriad of different segments that go into a same zone, maybe multiple wireless technologies that fit into it. But that zone itself is going to help you with the isolation methodology. And the difference between that health and safety equipment and the rest of these zones is critical, right? So always keep the health and safety stuff implemented separately. It will usually be done that way from the manufacturer. And if it's been bridged in any way, it's a problem generally. It's not intended to be that way. But here you take in our standard best practices, everything you guys have seen. The suppliers themselves of these OEM systems will have guidelines that they've got that are pretty straightforward to follow. They'll provide data flows that you can use to understand what should be talking to what. And then you can do tricky things like introduce your own passive monitoring platforms into these environments to get flows if the customer can't explain that to you. So Wireshark has a great set of ICS protocol decodes in it that you can use to identify flows between control systems and machines, as an example. You can introduce that if it's a modern switch using SPAN or ER SPAN technologies like we all might use to. You can also go the route of some type of a tap. Lots of people sell taps, passive taps that go into the environment that allow you to collect that type of traffic. Even just seeing the broadcast traffic will help you identify assets on these segments, just to be clear. So coming out of that, you go into, like I was just saying, focusing on the safety critical access, making recommendations around how to separate them. And then you deal with my transient systems, which are temporarily connected devices. That's the next step. So lots of this data is either going to come through observation or conversations with the plant control techs that work in the environment today. So simple questions are, how do you do updates on these platforms right now? When you need to make a lateral logic change in a PLC, what is the method of doing that? And some companies, you'll hear great secure remote access stories where they hop into their platform and they come across and there's multi-factor authentication and the session's recorded and they can only get to a single asset at a time. And all sounds pretty straightforward, and as long as that's documented, monitored, and managed, that's a great solution. Some of them will be, well, I plugged a Sierra wireless device into the back end of this control system. I connect to it when I need to and make changes, but nobody's ever going to find it because it's some random IP out there on the internet, right? So that's obviously an issue. And then the less obvious issues, like I was saying before, are the machines, the physical laptops, that'll move from the IT side of the environment, for lack of a better term, to the OT side of the environment. And those platforms are often maybe even invisible to central leadership organizations running technology because the automation central production management group in a large organization may have authorized these folks to go get Toughbooks or something like that, that are not enrolled in your normal management practices, that the guys keep in their truck as they drive down the pipeline, and they use to get to these different components, right? And so knowing that they are doing that can sometimes be a bit of a game you have to play with them, right, to collect the data. So you have to present yourself as trying to help, you're gonna improve things, you're not gonna make their jobs harder. Because if you do, they're not gonna talk to you and they're not gonna expose those manual processes. But if they see you as an asset, which is kind of what I'm trying to explain with this whole conversation is, you be the control system guy's advocate, and then you use this approach in order to articulate things to central organizations. You can connect the worlds, right? You can connect both dots and be everybody's friend in order to get things done. And you can explain to the control system guys why it's valuable in a friendly way, and you fit it into their maintenance program and that kind of thing. But those machines that move back and forth are a major area of concern, let alone when they put loads on USB drives, right? Plugging a USB drive from one side into the other, you'll see weird solutions, if you guys haven't been out there in the field, of like plastic physical locks on tops of USB ports that lock people out from actually plugging gear in, all the way to USB detection technology with more monitoring operating systems, all the way to things like whitelisting that'll control those ports completely. So, myriad of solutions, but same problem with every one. So, you have to come up with a thought process, and I honestly kind of think of it as a DMZ running some type of profiling, where the operator can still plug his machine in, the OEM tech can still plug his machine in, they can get to action very quickly because they're there for a reason, they're expensive resources, let alone they're usually out there solving production problems. And you don't have to get in the middle of that unless they fail your posture validation checks, right? So, unless they can't confirm that they had a management of change ticket in order to be there, which they probably always should. It's another process I didn't mention before, I should have, by the way, is management of change, actual practices in field locations vary widely. And you can control a lot with that and use that as a helpful hammer in your process toolbox to back up the technology we're talking about. Separating that environment out into zones is the best model, but there are always exceptions to the rule. There's gonna be a case where you've got to deal with things being inserted that may not be able to go through your posture checks because you're in a production line down situation. So what is your integrity check process after that is the question. So what do you go through to make sure that you know what's been changed and you know that there's not a major difference in the configurations, or you can articulate what the risk is to leadership to accept that risk. So just be aware that you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good in these environments. Do what you can. You're not going to be able to do everything you want to do, just to be clear. So by the time you get through this, and 3, by the way, is the longest part of the first part of this process, so that's why I'm trying to rush through it. You can't forget about wireless. The Lots of more modern control systems are using wireless sensing technology. They're using proprietary protocols over wireless in order to gather data. They're using standards-based protocols, just traditional Wi-Fi, to connect to sensors in the field. Depending on the configuration of those platforms, which are often hidden from technology groups, it may or may not be as secure as it should be according to your risk management model. I've seen lots of environments where they're running old Motorola gear that's wide open that we have to deal with, and the information being passed may not be critical, or it may be public source, but then you've got to still deal with the integrity of the data that might flow over that, and could it be compromised? Another key piece that we get people on quite a bit when we do this is the Bluetooth devices in the control room are very simple to compromise. So if you can get into a plant location, and some of them have strict physical security policies that might be a compensating control for this, just to be clear. But if I can sit in a waiting room, I can run BlueKeep and take control of a mouse and then start inserting code into Intel mice, Microsoft mice. There's a whole myriad of them that are still vulnerable to it, and without actually having to move a mouse around a screen. So Bluetooth protocol stuff, even though it's short range, is generally an attack vector you have to consider as you're going through this. So I always bring that up because when we think about wireless, we think about networking, but it's not just networking. It's personal peripherals as well. And then the last step of what I'm going to tell you ZCR4 will get you to is, do you need to do something at this facility or not? So 5, 6, and 7, those processes are very detailed, and they're much more like what you might think of. You go through in a traditional risk assessment in the IT world when you're trying to identify something. When you do this, you're generally going to have to do it at scale across lots of locations, across lots of SUCs. So just running through ZCR 1 through 4 will get you to the point of what is the security level target recommendation, and what is the actual security level, and what gaps do we have according to those 5 pillars I mentioned, that we can then articulate to leadership of any type about risk, right? And using that threat matrix I described earlier, you can apply that threat matrix to say, these are the types of actors that are going to be involved based on the security level we've assessed. And it's generally pretty easy to get down to brass tacks on that. So I knew I was going to be running out of time at this point. So we don't really have enough time to go through 5, 6, and 7 today. Like I said at the beginning, anybody that wants it, and even if you guys have folks that aren't in the room today that want it, I'll share my data with anybody that needs it, and Marty McGuffin in the back of the room can also act as a contact. But we'll share with you our whole process, the details behind each step of this, and even templates you can use to do these assessments in the field. And we're happy to help anybody just discuss them, generally speaking. But the 5, 6, and 7 components come after you make a decision that you need to go further. So you don't always need to do ZCR 1 through 7. You need to do it when you have a major failure between your security level target and your security level achieved. So because I just wanted everybody to have a context, this is just ZCR 5 alone. So when you get to this point of the process, you're talking about identifying threats, vulnerabilities, consequences, impact, unmitigated likelihood of mitigated cyber security risk, which by the way is different. So the concept there is, if we don't have, our controls aren't effective, what does the control system security posture look like versus if my controls are effective? Because you'll find lots of people think they have controls, but they don't work, or they're misconfigured, or they've been shut off, or they're laying on the floor in the control room because they caused a problem one night and they pulled it out and they didn't tell you, right? Those are all common practical outcomes. And then you kind of run through this loop of applying your theoretical control to the environment now that you understand it, taking that theoretical outcome and reassessing the security level that would be achieved based on the work that you've done in order to decide if you've mitigated it enough, and at the end, you produce reports that can go to leadership about what you can do and what you can't. So ZCR 6, 5 is the big step of work, right? So if you were asking me to scope ZCR 1 through 4, that's a 2-week process, maybe even for a large system. If you're asking me to scope a full ZCR 1 through 7, that's 6 weeks of work, just to be clear, to really dive into all the details. But 6 is where you actually write up your cybersecurity requirements, that CSR I talked about in the beginning. And this produces you reports and things that are described in ways that are consumable by your standard executive leadership, risk management, GRC group, something like that. And then, before you show it to anybody, you always get whoever runs that asset's approval, because you need their buy-in before you can take it to executive leadership. If you don't get that plant manager on board with your recommendations, what's going to end up happening is your poor IT CISO is going to roll into the room and tell people they need to do X, Y, and Z, and they're going to get laughed out of the room, and no money's going to be spent. So no time's going to be allotted, no resources are going to be assigned. You have to kind of split the gap on making sure you're not a sycophant, you're not telling the asset owner what he wants to hear, you're telling him what he needs to hear, and you're gaining his buy-in. And then once you get his buy-in, generally speaking, moving up the business organization is a faster route to remediation than moving up a risk management organization. And then now that you kind of have heard about 62443, if you hadn't seen it before, the hope that I've got for you guys today is that just you leave with some of those common terms and understanding. You know that you can go look at this framework. I don't expect anybody was memorizing it as I was going through it. And then you can start to apply that to your control systems. And I think I'm out of time, as the man in the corner says, so I'll stop there. But if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to hit me. Marty McGuffin, like I said in the back room, is another cavalry guy that works with me. Charles Tips is in the back of the room too. We can answer any questions you guys have. And thank you very much for the attention.